Yeah, I'm a writer who writes about human cognition, how it interacts with land to turn it into landscape. Land art is one of those manifestations. So I go around the world to look at land art projects and try and figure out how does this piece of art in this place help us understand where we live. So it's a big project. I'll never finish it while I'm alive, which is great. It's a full employment act for me. It's good. I have to say, so first of all, I love being in Switzerland. I've been coming to Switzerland since I was a young child, but not as often as I would like. So it's a real pleasure and honor that someone would say, Bill, come to Switzerland and do something. So there are colleagues in the audience with whom I've worked for many years, like Chris Taylor and Emily Scott and Sybil, and you will see slides of images of land arts that weave throughout that are the same images but put in different contexts. So for me, this is the best audience in the world. It's also the scariest because the people I work with are going to hear me talk about what I do. And they know me better than I know myself sometimes. All of you, or many of you have said, like, what happened? Well, at 4:30 in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, when Chris and I are walking back to the chalet from the table outside the hotel.
Which is only 1 minute.
It's less. It's seconds, right? Because
it's the whole world. It's a whole world away.
So to be human is to be vertical, and I mean that seriously. So I will talk about cognition and art more on Tuesday, less today. But to be human is to be vertical because we're not on all fours, we're on all twos. That means you are subject to a fall. So I fell down. And if you're a climber or if you've ever been around small children, you know that things like this look bad, but they don't hurt. I don't even have a headache this morning. So, it's good. But it's a reminder. So I woke up this morning going, oh, yeah, invention of the vertical. Yeah, it's a good reminder to keep being modest. Yeah. So to be in Switzerland and talking about the vertical is to talk about the birthplace of the vertical in modernism in a certain sense. In part because of images such as this by Wust, which is made in the late 1700s at the Rhone Glacier just below Furka Pass. And so this is one of those images where you have the artist standing in front of the ice. The ice is coming from a place high above. It is a river running down towards you that is very slow and as scary as can be. So the birth of the sublime and the vertical are very close together here in Switzerland, and they have informed the entire world. When I came here to Sierra 2 years ago, 3 years ago now? 3 years. Yeah. And I was and I was like stunned because it's like, oh, this is the vertical landscape that I have been dealing with my entire life. And I had forgotten that. And so coming back to Switzerland is a great relief for me. So Switzerland has long dealt with the vertical in different kinds of vertical settings, and this is one Sybil will talk about this. This is the Furka Pass, Furka Blick, the hotel there. And this is the beautiful place where we had a great introduction to Swiss and the vertical 3 years ago. And I was amazed. So what do you mean there's this art program that goes on for years in this hotel and no one knows about it outside of maybe a few people in Switzerland, a few scholars around the world, but almost no one knows about this. An astonishing variety of artists come to this place and make works that they are required, happily, to leave behind. And so Janis Osman, who curates the hotel and the property, maintains these works like these shutters by Daniel Buren, and these beautiful marks on an outbuilding by Richard Long that indicate the directions of the wind that he encountered when he was walking towards Furka Pass. People who were visiting artist Remy Zaug painting. This is 1986. Per Kirkeby. These are amazing artists who come from around the world and who are given materials very much like here. Here's the site. Here are the materials. What you make here will stay here. And it becomes this beautifully curated collection. So if you have a chance to somehow drive over Furka Pass, you can just drive right up to that Per Kirkeby. And there's a Max Bill piece that's beautiful, which I'll show you in a minute. So Roman Signer. Is Roman Signer coming? I thought he was not. I made up the fact he would be here. Yeah. So anyway, this is a beautiful vertical piece. It's something that goes up, which must come down. Huh? So and this beautiful piece of language from Goethe, put on the pass by Joseph Kosuth. And basically Kosuth is saying in these letters embedded in metal on this wall, he's saying, I'm up in the Alps and I notice that I do not talk so much about the human beings. I talk only about big nature because that's what is most important. So that's a wonderful piece. And in the background, you can see these low slones. That's a Max Bill piece. So one of the most important Swiss artists of the 20th century. And it is 4 pieces of granite that come together like this, and they surround a fire pit. Furka Pass was a place over which people have traveled for millennia, and he is making an homage to the fact that you come to the pass, you stop, you have a fire, you sleep, then you move on. So, Furka Pass is also one of the places where skiing was invented. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes author, he comes and he tries out Norwegian snowshoes. He basically sits on a pair of very wide, fat skis and slides downhill on his butt. And that's one of the inventions of skiing for the British, which is why Switzerland has been invaded by tourists happily for centuries since. There are more contemporary expressions in the Alps. This is a sculpture from Verbier, this kind of elephant. Verbier, the ski resort, very interesting place, where they have an annual art festival and kind of a year-round program. In a sense, this makes no sense to put an elephant on a ski resort in Switzerland. But of course, it's maybe an allusion to Turner's Hannibal crossing the Alps, right? The history of him bringing elephants across the Alps. I have mixed feelings about that. This I find more interesting in a way. So Neville Wakefield and his partner have been curating this thing called Elevation 1049 or 1049 in Gstaad. It's happened, I think, twice now. So this is from 2014, the first time they did this, and this is a Toblerone. So I always thought Toblerone was a candy you ate, so consuming the Alps, yeah? And but no, it's the shape of the bollards, if you will, that are put up to keep tanks from wandering aimlessly around the country and invading Switzerland. So he makes this shape out of ice, which is a very nice reminder of how temporary defenses are. The world leaks through anyway. So I think that's a pretty interesting sculpture. I like that. That's pretty interesting. And I also like this piece. And this is from the 2017 manifestation of 1049. And so here's a piece that juxtaposes ice and fire, which whenever that happens, I'm always like, ooh, that's interesting, yeah? Because those ideas don't cohabit naturally. It's difficult to put them together. They're always ephemeral because they are fighting with each other. And that's something I'll talk about in just a minute about the cameras facing me and the media, to pick up on what Hannah was saying. It's a good thing I have things to show because I hate being filmed. I hate the way I look when I look at myself on film. The only thing that gets me through it is the fact that the images are pulling me through this, and the fact that you're there smiling at me. So, and of course, this work, which is going to manifest itself here this year, around the corner, slightly to the left of where the proposal is made to make this beautiful painting on this rock. And actually, it's going to manifest right around the corner. I saw this image on the postcard, and so Johannes sends me this, and I'm thinking, that's fantastic. It must be really high in the Alps. No, it's almost on the Rhine River. It's very low. So I found that as an interesting cognitive dissonance in my perception of, this is in the Alps, it must be very high. No, it's actually, yeah, so I love that. So, but it's snow. So this is an indication of both making work in the vertical and dealing with the vertical, and now we're talking about the vertical. But to do that, of course, we have to talk about the horizontal because that's where I ended up at 4:30 in the morning. So, is it your fault, Chris, or Emily's that she bought the vodka? Or
I'm okay with it.
Yeah? Okay. All right. So this is Walter Di Maria's work, the mile-long drawing done in 1969. And so he gets to the Nevada desert, and he's wanted for years to make this. He wanted to make 2 long parallel walls, a mile long, so high you could not see over them. He couldn't actually build the walls, so he makes the drawing of the walls. He makes the schematic on the desert. He's with Michael Heiser. And Michael and Walter both grew up in the Bay Area, in San Francisco-ish. But they did not know each other until they moved to New York, and they became friends. And then Michael Heiser says, Walter, come with me out to the desert. This is a big place where we can make art, right? And the thing about these are works that I live with in the sense that I go to these places. This is my home territory. So also I've just finished writing a book about Michael Heiser called Michael Heiser, The Once and Future Monuments. That book will be published next spring. Emily's quoted in that book. Chris is in that book. So Sybil's in that book. All 3 of you are in that book. It's great. And so Michael does not, and that's the first time I'm saying this in public to a meeting. I'm saying this book is coming out because Michael does not know I have written this book, and he's going to be very upset. Not that I have said anything bad about him, but simply because he's a very private person, and the New York Times can write about him because it gives him leverage to fight people encroaching on his land. But when other people try to write about him, he gets very upset because he's very private. If you want to go see his work, and I will show you one image, and I will tell you when that image is, and please don't take a picture of it because it's a legal problem if you take a picture of it. Yeah. So anyway, so he's out here in the desert in 1969 with Walter D. Maria, and Walter wants to make these 2 lines on the desert, and he has no idea how to do it. And he's always like, do I take a stick? What do I do? And so a man named Guido Darrow, known in those days as Bob Darrow, Robert Darrow, Guido is the pilot for Di Maria and for Heiser, and he's the person who locates land for them to make projects on. And he is the one who is the fixer for them, so he gets water rights to the properties they buy and so forth. And we have Guido's archive, which is why part of the reason I'm so familiar with these stories. Guido says, oh, this is easy. In America, to make a football field, we have a chalk marker. Let's just buy one of the things that you use to put chalk on a football field, put chalk in it, and we'll just make the drum. That's how it's made. But it's a very old tradition. You know the Nazca lines. Does anyone here not know the Nazca lines? That's easy then. Okay, so I don't have to explain the whole history of this. So these artists were going to South America, and they're going to Stonehenge, they're going to the Nazca lines, they're going to Chichen Itza in Mexico and Teotihuacan. They're going to an Olmec site that I will show you. And they're thinking about how people have made marks on the land ever since we've come into the New World and have been in the Old World. So you find lines like this, and you find Richard Long, of course, you all know this, right, that he's walking in the grass. The work of art is the walk. Then there's the photograph. Then there's us looking at the photograph. So there's this long history of how we're squaring with this. It's really difficult for these people, all of these people who make these big gestures or small gestures in the land. It's very difficult to have a relationship with photography because if you're not there and you don't see the work in person, or if the work is ephemeral, it's like you're just looking at this kind of funny two-dimensional thing. So Walter and Heiser are out in the desert. Heiser has just made Double Negative. It's January 1970. Richard Serra comes to see Double Negative. Yeah? And Serra comes and he looks at Double Negative and he says, Mike, the only way to understand this is to see it from the air. But once you see this from the air, it simply becomes a flat piece of paper. It's not the same thing. And so I don't like land art because land art is graphic. Just a graphic thing. And Heiser goes, okay, never more will anyone ever show aerial photographs of my work. So there's a real tension between the images we're looking at and what the intent of the artists are. Intents are. And also, so Jerry Shum, he goes to make this movie of the land arts guys, and he promises Heiser he will not show aerial images of his work. He shows an aerial image, and Heiser says, I will never talk to you again. I mean, that's how fraught that relationship is. I mean, between the artists and the images I'm showing you, right? So here's Richard Long doing something on the Nazca Plains. So he's away from the Nazca lines. He's a little bit away, but he's close to it, and he's making a bigger line than he made in the grass when he walked. All of these artists, almost all of them, and it's true of many artists in the 20th century, all of them make work that gets bigger over time as they have more money and more fame, so they can attract more money. And that's that drive towards monumentality, which I'll talk about. This is a work that's not known so well. It's by Patricia Johansson. Patricia is in Max's Kansas City, the famous bar and performance space in New York City where everyone goes to drink every night. Not until 4:30 falling down, but pretty close. And so Richard Serra and Michael Heiser and Nancy Holt and Robert Smith and Patricia Johansson, Andy Warhol, all of these people are in this bar having a great conversation in the mid-1960s. So to think that any one person invented land art, as Michael Heiser would say, he thinks he invented it? Seriously? Really? So, Hannah, you showed these slides, right? From that great show at MoCA, The Ends of the Earth. I mean, land art was a thought in the air that was around the world at that time. But nonetheless, so here's Patricia doing a work that almost no one remembers. 1,600 feet long, was only up for 2 days. Yeah? And so she's sitting in that bar being very quiet because she's a shy young woman. She has the first show of minimalism, a solo show of minimalism in an art gallery in New York City. She's way ahead of everyone else. That's a whole nother lecture, what happens to Patricia and what she's doing now. She is now moving more dirt than Michael Heiser, just to say it's nice to see that come around. So Mike, actually, I'm going to go to this one first, I think. So Mike is talking to Di Maria. He brings him over to his loft, and Mike's making a living by painting other people's lofts and by exterminating rats in New York City. He's not doing well as an artist in the city. It's too competitive. And he's making these big paintings that slowly they get so big they start to get deep, so the paintings are this wide off the wall, and they start to have big hollow voids in the middle of them. It's not his idea, but it's an idea that's in the air. And then he says, I need to do this in the ground. So he has a model on his coffee table of 4 solid geometric shapes. So there's a cone, an inverted cone, the double square, and so forth. And those are now finally fully realized in the way he wanted them at Dia Beacon in New York. But this is the first time he does it. His father is Robert Heiser. Robert Heiser is a very famous archaeologist at UC Berkeley. And Robert owns a cabin at South Lake Tahoe, so very close to where I live. And so Heiser knows Tahoe and the area very intimately. And so in 1967, he takes a break from New York City. He goes to get married in Carson City, and because in Nevada it's easy to get married very quick, right? So he marries the model he's been dating for years. And he digs this hole and sets this plywood box into the hole. It's a plywood box that actually has 2 inserts, or 2 negative spaces. So you see the one, and then in the bottom of that there's another small box, yeah? And that's his invention of what he calls negative sculpture. Negative sculpture is all about the vertical. So it's not, so Heiser is not thinking so much about the vertical then. It is beginning to think about it. But he's already digging in the ground, and that's the part of vertical we forget, right? But horizon, what I'm standing on, is what we think of as the baseline, and vertical always goes up, and then also goes down. So today I'm talking about works that mostly we look at from the ground looking up. On Tuesday I'll talk about what happens when you go above the earth and you look down. So 2 kinds of vertical. Heiser then does this. He makes these 9 depressions. He calls them 9 Nevada depressions. It's actually 8 in Nevada, 1 in California. But there are these holes he digs of various kinds in these dry lake beds. Now, Mike likes dry lake beds for a couple of different reasons. One, there's no trees, so you can see what's going on. You can actually, when this was made, these different pieces were made, you could see them from the air miles away, even though they are relatively small. And this is on the Black Rock Desert. This is where Burning Man is held. Yeah, so this is a precursor to artists using Burning Man, right? So here we are in 1968, and Mike's digging these trenches and then putting in these boards, right? So he says, I'm not an earth artist. I don't just use earth. I use steel. I use wood. I use all these other materials. So he quarrels with that term. He's not happy with the idea that he's identified as an earthworks person, right? But then Mike quarrels with almost everything. So the hole he dug in Lake Tahoe, next to Lake Tahoe, had boards in it to hold in the square. It was not just earth. It was also a sculpture that was actually placed in the earth. And so here he's doing the same kind of thing. Those 9 sculptures covered a distance of 540 miles across the length of Nevada, going from Las Vegas all the way up to the Oregon border. So he said this is the biggest sculpture in the world. Mike always likes a big statement. Yeah? He gets the big statement from Richard Serra and Frank Stella and these other guys, all guys, right? And they're making these short sentences, these short, declarations, right? Declarative sentences. So art is what you see. Make art of what you know. Art is only art. He loves that. He thinks that's confrontational. He likes that. That's his personality. So he makes these very severe statements, and he still does. He's actually not very well right now, so he doesn't talk as much as he used to, which is good because every other word is a swear word that begins with the letter F. And Sybil's heard me say that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So here he is in Munich. He's making the Munich Depression. He goes to have a show in Munich in a gallery, and he's taken out to the edge of the city, and he's looking at this land, and he says, I don't want to do anything in a gallery. I want to do something here. He digs a hole for the first time. For the first time, he uses an excavator. He uses a machine. So the work I showed you in the Black Rock Desert, the works that he was making in those days, he and Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson are in the Nevada desert with shovels making holes. They're doing it by hand, right? So for the first time, he has a gallerist who says, we can get a machine. And he makes a big hole, right? So again, this is that notion of the vertical. And the idea was, I can be inside this hole, and it will be a beautifully even horizon. And he gets the operator of the machine to make the surround, the rim of that hole very soft. So it's like you're standing at the bottom and the earth just kind of goes away and you can't see any buildings around it. This is directly related to Terrell's rodent crater and to his problem he's having in Texas. Yeah. So this is the first time this is done. He thinks, so this is the problem with Mike and time, right? He thinks that this will last forever. And he says, this work will last as long as no one builds a building around it. You can't see anything if you're at the bottom of the hole. Within months, those apartment buildings in the back, they're already coming out and onto the hole, and the hole is destroyed. So Mike has, he thinks things last a long time. Double negative. He digs this in 1969, 1970. He does not himself dig this. Another myth. There are these pictures of Mike, in a bulldozer. He wasn't actually in those pictures. He was not actually at double negative. He was in his property in Nevada where City is being made. I'll show you images. He actually hires a guy from a town nearby to make this work. And the guy said, this is the most dangerous thing I ever did because a Caterpillar, the machine, the bulldozer, they can only drive at 45 degrees. It's not as steep as the fields that are being harvested right out here with the grass, right? So Chris and I are driving around like, but wait, a Caterpillar tractor can't drive on something this steep, right? We were amazed. But he hires an operator with a big tractor, and the guy bulldozes this thing at 45 degrees, these two ramps on this mesa, going like this. This work is 1,500 feet long. It's the same length as Spiral Jetty, but in a different dimension in a way. It's longer than the New York Empire State Building is tall, and he describes it that way. So he's comparing this to architecture. Yeah? So one of the things that we deal with is what do people do with these earthworks when they see them? Because they're at the scale of architecture, which means you interact with them physically, which means graffiti, parties. It means all these different things. I should show you an image of the parties, right, that artists have had in this space. So Mike makes these trenches. He thinks it's going to last literally for 100 years. Virginia Dwan gives Guido Darrow the money to go buy this piece of property. Mike has not seen the property. Guido says, I've got a great place for you. He flies Mike over it, and Mike, on the spot as he's flying over it, figures out to make double negative. Right? It's not a plan he had in mind for a site beforehand. It's, I see the site, I know what to do with the site. So he makes this gesture, and right when he's making that gesture, Robert Smithson is thinking about doing something in the Great Salt Lake. Here he is with Richard Serra walking around this early version of Spiral Jetty. So I have at the museum in Reno, we have 2,000 images of both Heiser and Walter D. Maria working in the field. Walter wrote me just before he passed away, and he said, like, what do you have of me? What are you going to do with it? And I wrote him back, and I said, I have 600 or 400 photographs of you working in the field. I promise I'm not going to publish them, but I may show some of them in the museum. And he says, okay, it's fine. So Sarah and one of the photographs is Sarah and Smithson sitting in a pickup truck looking down at Spiral Jetty. And Spiral Jetty goes like this and stops. It's not a spiral, it's just a hook. And Sarah says, Bob, you have to keep going. You have to finish the spiral. You can't stop. And so Smithson comes back to make the spiral. So the first version is not the thing we know. It's a second version. So by extending that hook and making it an actual spiral. So there they are walking on this. The vocabulary that these people are inventing, whether it's the framing device of Nancy Holt, or it is a Spiral Jetty, or it's double negative, the most important thing, I think, for me in terms of art history is the gestures they're making, the vocabulary they invent is used by artists today to do other things. So these people said, you can do big stuff in the landscape. Now artists make gestures that actually deal with ecological problems. So that's another talk that I'm not sure we'll get to this week. But here's Nancy, of course, again. I don't need to show you that too much. But I think what's interesting about this is, in some ways, the first American land artwork to deal with the sky. So when you because the holes, can you see? The holes are drilled to line up with stars during spring and fall equinox. And so everything, the constellations, when they're at the right time of year, line up with those holes. And you can sit inside the tubes and see the stars in those constellations. So she's being very deliberate to make a relationship between sky and ground and heaven and earth. Right? So it's a very powerful gesture. So people go at solstice now, and they come sit and they have parties here. Again, it's architectural in scale, so you're going to have interventions. It's a provocation, if you were. Walter D. Maria, the lightning field, same kind of thing. So we have a cocktail napkin drawn in a coffee shop in Las Vegas by Walter D. Maria. When he's talking to Guido Darrow, and he says, Guido, I want you to go find me a piece of land where I can do this. And if you know his spike beds, it's a series of poles, in the ground, this serial repetition, minimalist kind of gesture. And he says, go find me a place that has the most amount of lightning and where I can do this. And so Guido finds him a piece of property in Arizona that is very near the meteor. It's between the meteor crater in Arizona and James Terrell's rodent crater, right? And Guido is picking a place very carefully because he is trying to preserve Nevada for Michael Heiser, because Heiser's family grew up in Nevada, so he thinks Heiser's kind of claimed that state. Walter D. Maria originally wanted to do the lightning field in Nevada very close to where Michael Miser has made city, and Guido Darrow is careful to steer him to Arizona and then on to New Mexico where there's even more lightning. This photograph was taken by John Cleet. So Gianfranco Gorgoni, who was one of the early photographers who was traveling with these guys and flying with Guido to photograph their works, Gianfranco was asked by Walter D. Maria, Gianfranco, will you photograph this for me? And he says, yeah, God, this is going to be fantastic. The second version of the lightning field in New Mexico is this big project. It's beautiful. Of course I will photograph it. And then Walter says, and you will give me the negatives because I'm hiring you. And Gianfranco says, no, I'm an artist. These are my negatives, my images. What do you mean? So he does not photograph because he wants to retain rights to the images, right? So he walks away, and Walter hires a young photographer, John Cleet, who is starving. And so Cleet gives him the negatives. He says, you take pictures, you give me the negatives. He's out in the lightning field for a week. He's photographing it in all different times of day. This is that God hour when the sun is setting and the lightning storms are coming in the late afternoon. Same kind of pattern here. And he takes this photograph, and seconds later the lightning hits his truck. And it cooks the truck. He's fine. But the truck is like every wire is melted basically in the truck, right? So he has to get towed out and have all the wiring replaced. So he was fine. So these kinds of stories, sometimes I'm criticized because I tell stories about the artworks and the people who made them. It's like, Bill, you're not dealing with the formal matters of vocabulary and art history. Yeah, but I think the stories inform how we understand these works. I think it's important we know the stories. So the book that I've written is full of stories, which is why Mike's going to be upset. This is in Turkey. It's Anatolia. It's southern central Turkey. This is a work starts getting constructed in about 9100 BC, so it's 11,000 years old. This is the earliest known instance that we know of so far of human beings lifting up stones to go vertical. There's a default position that archaeologists take about why do we do this? And it's religion. It's like, yeah, we're supplicating to connect heaven and earth, and we're supplicating to the powers that be, please be nice to us. We're honoring you. Give us water. Make sure we have food. We don't want to really have a war. Or if we have a war, we want to win. So all these monuments, these vertical things that grow up around us, start very, very early. And so again, remember that Michael Heiser's father is Robert Heiser, an archaeologist who specializes in understanding how big stones were moved in antiquity. Here's a mastaba. So this comes from Mesopotamia. It's in Egypt, but this is the largest early mastaba in Egypt. It's about 3100 BC. And so you get this beautiful truncated shape. It's an easy shape to make. You can do it with dirt. You can do it with stones. You can do it with earth and stones rammed together. Different ways you can make mastabas. And eventually, of course, that culminates in these guys. Or maybe it culminates here. So this is the Mustafa-Bhai Crystal that's now in Hyde Park. And so it's over 7,000 barrels around kind of a plastic and hollow core. It floats. That was his intent. But his real intent is to do this. This is his proposal in 1977 for Abu Dhabi. This is the mastaba he really wanted to build, and he may still build. So this is an early drawing that he sold in order to raise funds for this project that didn't get done. 410,000 barrels it would take to do this, compared to 7,000 in Hyde Park. So this is the real gesture. This is what he really wants to do. Here's a more modern version. How do you say a Photoshop version, a CAD version of what he wants to do. This is larger in mass, in height, but also in mass, but twice as large as the pyramids, right? It's enormous. I don't know if he gets to do it or not, but we'll see. There's enough money there to do it. So this drive towards monumentality is something that these artists have been fascinated with. This is Michael Heiser's favorite artist. This is Gustav Borglum. This is, the Mount Rushmore monument of the four presidents, to which it's been proposed that either Obama or Trump should be added. I don't think that's going to happen. So it's a big gesture. These heads are 60 feet high. They're almost 20 meters high. Right? They're large heads. It took a long time to make this. He starts in 1927. He finishes in 1941. Heiser says he's the most underrated art. Well, actually, there are two favorite artists. This one and Richard Serra. Richard Serra is the only artist who's living who Michael Heiser likes to be compared to. He says, Serra and me, we're it. Everybody else, not so much. So this gets made, and soon after it's made, in the 1940s, so in 1948, the Native Americans say, we want our own monument. White presidents, white male dead guys, really? We want our own monument. So this is Crazy Horse, Chief Crazy Horse. And this is, you can see the machines on the edge of this when it's done is going to look, that's the maquette for it. It's really stupid, but it's really big, right? And I say stupid in terms of, well, the Native Americans don't think it's stupid. They think it's really important, and it's powerful, and it expresses the way they lived on the land compared to the president. So it's not stupid to them. But when you look at this, you think, oh, it's a figurative sculpture. It's just one more, So the context is interesting, complicated. So here's my Kaiser. He's not yet made double negative. So he's made the depressions in the Nevada desert. This is 1969. And he's driving up to Lake Tahoe over Spooner Summit, which is a pass that goes over from the desert where I live up to Lake Tahoe. And they're widening the road, and there's a big road cut, and there are these big boulders sitting on the ground. And he says, ooh, what would happen if I took these boulders down to the desert? So I kind of return them to where they came from. He has this it's a conceit. The mountains get lifted up. They take the rocks from the desert, and they lift them up into the Sierra. So, and Nevada has 340, 360 separate mountain ranges. So it's a place where this happens a lot. This is the terrain he grows up in. So he understands this geological mechanism. He wants to do this. That's Earl Casaza, whose trucks he rents from Reno, and cranes to lift up these rocks. The biggest one, he wants to lift up 4 rocks and take them to the desert. The 4th rock, the biggest one, breaks the crane. It's like 120 tons. The crane's not strong enough to lift the rock. That is the idea that ends up at LACMA in levitated mass, the worst thing he ever did. But anyway, so he's lifting up these rocks at Spooner Summit, and he puts them on a truck, and they drive them down in the dark because they're late because one crane broke. They had to use the smaller crane. They get the smaller rocks, and they end up on this little playa, which is about 60 miles as the crow flies from Lake Tahoe. So he's on a small little playa, and they drop the rocks by moonlight. They don't really know what they're doing. They kind of know what they're doing. But one ends up horizontal, one ends up tilted, 45 degrees, one ends up vertical. And that becomes part of his vocabulary he's still using today. So he does this, and the 4th rock, the big one that he wanted to dig a trench that was not very big, and it was lined with concrete, but it's very simple and small. So it's about this wide, and it's about the length from me over there to the basketball hoop, right? And he wants people to walk under the rock. Now, there's no security for that. It's an enormous rock. It would have been so claustrophobic and so threatening and so dangerous, right? It would have been great, especially to do that in the late 1960s. Instead, of course, you all know this, right? This is levitated mass at LA County Museum of Art, LACMA. The original gesture would not have been safe enough to take a kid through. This thing has these big steel brackets with this enormous concrete trench, so it's totally sanitized, it's very safe, and it's boring and kind of meaningless. It's a beautiful rock. It's a beautiful setting, but the way they come together is like, really? That's not so much. But again, so the idea I'm trying to set is that he develops a vocabulary very early, and he keeps repeating that vocabulary throughout his entire career. So this is a photograph from City. This was the New York Times, so that we're safe to show this, yeah? And this is 45, 90, 180. So this is that idea of dropping things on 3 planes. This is related to something he wanted to do here in Switzerland that he never got to do, but he kept the idea, and it's manifested in his major piece, right? His culmination of his career. To give you an idea of how big these concrete forms are. By the way, if you walk away from this, how many people know what Complex 1 looks like? The big bunker shape with the concrete beams? Yeah, everybody kind of knows. If you walk away from Complex 1, the concrete beams form a perfect frame, so it's anamorphic. You take a specific viewpoint, and it's perfectly framed. This does the same thing. If you walk away from this, all the concrete lines up and forms a perfect rectangle. How big these are? They're that big. They're really big. Yeah. So this is the City project that I'm going to show you an image of in a bit. It's the largest single sculptural unit on the planet. This is Complex 1. This is the original first thing he did in the early 1970s, the first element of City. And now it's cleaned up. When I was there working with Heiser in the late 1990s, this was all just dirt. It didn't have that curbing around it. It was not clean. But this is the way it's meant to see. So what he's doing is he's taking European geometry, and he's talking about the vertical, and he's juxtaposing with everything in between that other piece I showed you, the 45, 90, 180, and this, Complex 1. They bracket this entire sculpture, and what's in between are Mesoamerican forms based on a map that his father drew with his colleagues at a site called La Venta in southern Mexico. I'll talk about that in a second. Please do not take a picture of the next image because it will cause legal problems for the artist who made it, and for you, and for me, and for everybody. So this is City. This is an aerial view by Michael White. Yeah, it's it's a great photograph. All right, so it went from a series that we own. We did not commission, I have to be very clear about this, we did not commission Michael White to do this. I did suggest to him that Mike might be in New York at a certain period, so we'd not be there with his guns to shoot at Mike when he was flying overhead. So I said, probably it's safe. If you wanted to go do this, you could do it. So Mike is a pilot. He flies over a city and he makes these photographs. Right after he did this, John Franco Gorgoni, the photographer who photographed the early works, flies over city and with Guido Darrow and takes pictures of this. So I'm not going to show you those. So this is a completely unauthorized image. Mike was doing exactly what Heiser does not want anyone to do, which is fly in the map of the land. So he's about 1,000 feet in the air. It's legal to take the photograph. It's legal for me to show it to you. It's legal for me to exhibit it in the museum. It's not legal for me to publish it. And it's not legal for it to go online on the internet. So this is the one image that you take out. Yeah? But what you see here, so there are those geometrical forms. Complex one is at the far end, 45, 80, 90 is at this end, and in between are these forms that Heiser gets from La Venta. And so what you see, the green stuff you see, those are his alfalfa fields. So if you grow alfalfa and feed it to cows, you get a tax break, so it makes it affordable to live in the middle of the desert. James Terrell does the same thing at Road and Crater. He raises cattle to get a tax break. Otherwise it gets expensive. So this is a place that Michael Heiser never went in person. Mike was going with his father. Mike never graduated from high school. He was a terrible student. He was rambunctious, short attention span, foul-mouthed. He can't even get out of high school. So his mother says, Robert, take your son with you out to the desert, right? And so he does. He takes him to all these archaeological sites around the world, including to places like the Colossi of Memnon, where his father is studying, like, how did they actually move the largest stones ever moved by human beings? That's where Heiser, in part, gets his inspiration to move big rocks, right? So this form of this truncated pyramid, the round mound at the close end, and these geometries. So I'm at Mike's house, and he hands me his father's archaeological report from La Venta, and he says, this is my Bible. So what I have is that book, and you can take Robert Heiser's drawing of La Venta, and I can put it next to the blueprint that Mike gave me of City from 1997, and you can say, oh, it's a direct correspondence between these things, right? So it's lovely to be able to tell that story. So Mike starts making City in the early 70s, right after Double Negative. He says to Guido Darrow, go find me a big piece of land that I can buy where no one can see what I'm doing. Buy me a big chunk of land where I can keep everyone away. And he's still keeping us everyone away, unless you have a lot of money to give him. He keeps you away. At the same time, he is beginning to think about, so vertical, I don't just have to go on the ground, I can also go up. So he goes to Santis, which is how close? Johannes, how close is Santis? Santis, yeah. How close is that from here? It's close.
Yeah, it's
100 kilometers.
100 kilometers, okay, yeah.
in an
So
hour you're there.
exactly so. So he's going there with a gallerist every day during the summer of 1970. He's going there to look at mountains where he can take a piece of rock and drop it. He can put wedges in the rock, and rain will fall in, and it will expand the cracks. How am I doing for time? It's okay?
It's okay.
Okay, 41 minutes, okay. So anyway, so he has this idea to do this in Switzerland. Those mountains are not granitic. They're sedimentary. It's limestone, I think. And so they don't work very well. The rock is incompetent. He can't do this. He can't drop this. So he tells Guido Darrow, I want you to fly. And this is a later print he makes of this from 1985. And so he's still dealing with this idea again and again and again. He's frustrated. He really wants to do this. He gives Guido Darrow a drawing, and he says, look, go find me a place I can do this. So just like Walter D. Maria says, go find me a place with lightning where I can put these rods out, right? He says to Guido Darrow, he says, go find me a place I can do this. And so eventually, Guido's flying all over Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Montana, Wyoming. He's looking for a place to find a good piece of rock he can drop. And finally in Montana, he finds this place. And so this is the Pintler Wilderness, Pintler. And he finds this place where there's a big block of granite that they could actually put the wedges in, or maybe use a bit of dynamite to drop the piece, and it will, as it slides down the mountain, it will create this fan of debris in front of it. So it's kind of like double negative again, right? It's positive, negative. But he wants nature, he wants gravity to make this piece, because no crane in the world is big enough to do this, right? But it turns out Here's another image of what he wants to do. It turns out this place is so dangerous to get to and so expensive that they have to use multiple helicopters and big crews because they got to this place and went to look at the site. They're taking these photographs. Mike does this kind of blueprint of what he wants to do. And the place is so hard to get to. They used horses to get to it. It took them days to ride in to this mountain. And it was very dangerous. And there were grizzly bears. I mean, not just cute little black bears that you would sit down and have lunch with. The big grizzly bears that will eat you for lunch, right? So it's like not a good place to go. So he never did this work. So there's the monumental strain, right? That's a monumental strain of land art. And then we think about Richard Long and a piece like this. He's making this in Peru. It's early 1972. This simple little ring will last longer than city. City's biggest problem is rain. Deserts are pluvial environments. They're carved by rain. This thing, it doesn't rain there so much. This could last 10,000 years, right? And still be there. On the other hand, these rings are kind of fragile. Here's a ring that Richard Long made a few years ago where I go hiking almost every weekend. This is right off the Pacific Crest Trail. So I walk to the site and I go sit there and have my water to drink and then I walk back. And this ring is now destroyed because other hikers have come along, taken these rocks and repurposed them to make other circles. Because they don't know it's a sculpture, right? It's a gesture in the landscape. Oh, this is cool. Let's make another ring. Cool. Move these rocks over here. So the rocks are still there, but they're now repurposed as different circles, which I think is interesting. So circles, so you get these straight lines, right? Like Richard Long in the Nazca Plain or walking in the grass, you get these straight lines and you get circles. So this is a Michael Heiser circle made in 1970. So all these people are having the same ideas at the same time. Yeah. And so these are circles. Now the heroic story is Michael Heiser was a really good motorcycle rider, and so he made these freehand, just making circles riding a motorcycle. Oh, bullshit. He puts down a stake on the ground, he takes a string, he draws out a circle, he puts old tires around, makes a circle. He and his buddy, who's a professional motorcycle rider, ride around during the day and they make these circles. And it's a wonderful piece, but we should not be mistaken. It's not a heroic single-person gesture. The photograph is being taken by Gianfranco Gorgoni on a tower built by Heiser, a scaffold, right? So he's been elevated above it so he can take it. So Gorgoni is both doing that on the scaffold, he's taking these pictures, and he's also being flown by Guido Darrow to take pictures from the air. So here's another beautiful image of this at sunset. It's a great project. So Heiser has made a work in Switzerland that still exists. It's fairly new. It's by the Mauvissant Dam. So that is over Furka Pass 3 hours from here, maybe? I don't know. Yeah, 3-4 hours? 7 hours. Okay. It's a long drive because it's small. Yeah. Exactly. You can't just fly. Yeah, you have to go. You have to drive. Yeah. So it's a long way. And so this is a work that we visited in this project 3 years ago. This is what the reservoir looks like behind the dam and the dam. It's one of the tallest dams in the world, 7th or 8th tallest in the world. And it's the largest dam of this kind in Switzerland. It's a beautiful, beautiful site. There's the reservoir, this beautiful glacial water full of glacial silt, called rock flour, right? So if you're in Nepal, you see water like this, you call it Dud Kosi. It means milk river, yeah? So it's the sediments that are being scraped off by the glaciers on the rocks. So it's a very beautiful place. If you look at this, if you walk up on top of the dam, I think it looks like it's out of Tolkien. It's an amazing site. This is mythical. But here's this hotel at the bottom, kind of below the dam, and there's this Michael Heiser circle, right? So it's the same thing he's doing in the desert. So how does this horizontal gesture, bless you, end up in a place of complete verticality? This place is so steep. I mean, they picked this cow pasture and level it to put this here, in part because it's safe from avalanches. I mean, it's a very vertical, really beautiful place, and you can see how vertical it is in this photograph. So we're driving around on these roads to get up here to the village, yeah? And we're thinking like, oh, this is like that road up to the dam. It's 1 lane wide. How could you get a truck with these big arcs of steel up that? But they did. It's amazing, right? And here they are working actually on the sculpture, in which Sybil and I and others have sat with a garden gnome, because that's the right thing to do. So we've actually sat in the sculpture and had a discussion about how problematic it is. Right? So why would that gesture from a horizontal desert end up in this vertical place? So Mike Heiser, I call him before I come over to see these, see the sculpture, and I say, so Mike, I'm going to, to look at your rings, vertical displacement, you call it, in Switzerland. He says, yeah, I don't know why the fucking Swiss would make my fucking sculpture in the Alps, which are so fucking beautiful already, but it's a really fucking good piece, right? So he has this notion that he never went to the site. This was bought basically at I think during an art fair was when the
Art Basel.
Yeah, Art Basel, yeah. So they commissioned this piece, and he builds it for a lot of money. So what's the relationship between the site and the artist and the vertical? So I think it's a really wonderful discussion to have. I love the fact that I think this work is great that it's there because it makes us talk about it.
It's working very well as a picnic.
It's what?
It's working very well as a picnic place.
Yeah, exactly so. Yeah. So I went. So you guys are eating fondue and you're having a beer in the hotel. I walked down. It's at sunset to go look at the piece, and there's a woman harvesting mushrooms. Right. So anyway, it's a lovely piece, but it's very interesting how a horizontal gesture ends up in dialogue with a dam that is curved. So I think the geometry of the piece is interesting because the dam is like this, and the piece is like this, and it's vertical and steep and threatening. And it goes back to that painting by Wust, done in the 1700s, a steep, dangerous, sublime place, and I'm going to make an artistic gesture, but a very different kind of gesture at this point. So Charles Ross and Michael Heiser share a studio in San Francisco in 1966. They're in a building together, and Michael Heiser is making figurative paintings, kind of in the style of Park. So he was making Diebenkorn in those days. He was making these paintings of people in landscape, and they're not bad paintings. And Charles Ross is collecting debris along the shore of San Francisco Bay, making sculptures. And one day, Charles Ross has a dream about prisms. The morning when he wakes up, he clears out his studio, he takes everything to the dump, and he starts work that will lead to this, which is called Star Axis in New Mexico. Michael Heiser's watching his friend Charles go through this transformation. Soon, Michael will stop making figurative paintings, and he starts doing something else. So this work is almost done. So City should be open in 2020 for all of us to visit, in theory. James Turrell's Road and Crater should be open in 2020 for us to visit. Star Axis by 2020 should be open for us to visit. All of them have places like the Lightning Field where you can spend the night. And the theory is, that we all go get to see these, and as well we'll see. So this is what this looks like during the day, and this is what it looks like sort of at night. Time-lapse photographed by Charles Ross of Star Axis. So like the Nancy Holt piece, it's aligned with, in this case, the North Pole star. So this celestial, this relationship to the vertical, I think reaches its kind of culmination with this guy, James Terrell. Terrell's a pilot. His dad was an aircraft engineer and mechanic. And so Terrell was flying airplanes when he was 8 years old. By 16, he was flying monks out of Burma to China, working for the CIA. He was a really talented pilot. So Terrell, in the 1970s, instead of hiring Guido Darrow to go find a site for him, flies himself around the western United States to find a place where he can make, like Munich Depression, he can make a crater, he can make a hole in the ground that you can lie down in the middle of. And if it's a perfectly even rim, and you lie down in the middle of it, you experience the sky as a bowl that is turned upside down. It's a physical manifestation called celestial vaulting, and it's a very specific kind of perceptual shift that happens if you're in a very specific kind of place. So here's where you would lie down. This is the center of Road and Crater. And there are these four plinths that are oriented to the cardinal points, and you lie down on these and you have this experience, right? And then inside the crater, Terrell has made tunnels. Actually, what he does is he digs a trench, because it's a cinder cone, so you couldn't dig a hole through it like this. You have to excavate a trench, you make the tunnel, you make the shape of the passageway, and then you bury it again, right? So this is the interior of one of the keyhole, the very famous passage, and it kind of looks like this. And some of the spaces look like this. They're really magnificent, beautiful spaces. Terrell, the biggest problem Terrell has is he's using precious materials like gold, and getting those things to stay put in place is difficult. He wants this to last not 100 years like Heiser and double negative. He wants it to last 10,000 years. So that's his engineering standard. Good luck. So I have 3 more slides. Excuse me. This is Ugo Rondinoni's 7 Magic Mountains that we commissioned him to make outside of Las Vegas. This sculpture sees, so the rocks are about 44,000 pounds apiece. They are 35 feet high. Vogue goes there to make fashion shoots. People go there to get married. 2 days after we put this up, the guys put this up and painted the rocks and had this all done. Beyonce shows up. We had 200 million hits online. The second day this was opened. About 1,000 people go there a day. I was just there with the Swiss embassy, with the consul general in San Francisco to do talk about sustainability and the desert at Switzerland, kind of trying to compare the two. It's a very interesting idea. And we photographed it at sunset. It was about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a 3 hours of interviewing people. It was Quite a process. Color. So why would you put something like this in that environment? The idea was you put this up for 2 years, then you take it away. So you make a provocation that's architectural in scale, but color. So Ugo, of course, that's his palette, right, the rainbow. And he talks about, and John Giorno, his partner, basically says, oh, Ugo, you've made how do you say, pop art and land art come together. And that's exactly what Ugo's been saying ever since. So the colossi of Memnon, I should have a slide. Again, the biggest rocks ever moved by human beings, Thebes, these enormous seated figures, right, that Yeats memorializes in his poem. And they're huge and beautiful and stern. And they're the color of the desert. They're the color of the rock, right? The Germans who went to refurbish that sculpture, those sculptures, those two-seated figures, about 10 years ago, to make the stone fresh again, they discovered traces of those colors all over those sculptures, right? They were brightly colored. Ugo did not know that when he made Seven Magic Mountains, but so I won't tell the whole story of what's behind this and why he did this and so forth, but I will say that, so we plan to take it down in May, and the public wrote us and said, please leave it there, we love this. We love this contrast. It makes us think about the desert. It makes us see the desert more clearly because you made this contrast. When I'm in Norway talking about land art, a Norwegian guy came up to me and I said, why would you put a sculpture in front of this fjord? The fjord's beautiful. Same question Mike Heiser asked, right? And he says, oh, well, you Americans, you only like the nature unadorned. Norwegians, we like a little house in the front so we know how big nature is. So in a way, that's what this piece does. And the last place I will show you in 2 images is Tippett Rise in Montana. This is a place that's difficult to get to. You can only drive there. You can't fly there. Well, you could if you had a helicopter and a lot of money. It's 10,000 acres, so it's a big property. 7 different ranches were bought by a couple from New York. She owns Grey Goose Vodka. He owns most of Manhattan. And they love Storm King. They love the sculpture park on the Hudson, near the Hudson River, where you can go see Andy Goldsworthy, and you can see an Ursula Riddingsvard, and you can see all these sculptures one next to another. Mark de Souvreau. They said, what if we had a sculpture park where you could not see one piece from another? What if it was so big that we could cite these things and you could only see one thing at a time? This is a Calder piece that they borrowed from the Guggenheim. Do you know how much money you have to borrow a piece from the Guggenheim? Much less something this big to cite it in rural Montana. It's crazy. Anyway, they have 11 Steinway pianos on the property. They give concerts next to these sculptures, and they have a full-time piano tuner who lives there to tune the pianos. So that's good. Life is good. So you drive up, and this is the first sculpture you see. And so I drive into this property. It's not open for the season. It's early. It's late winter. It's not open yet. I drive in with a friend who works there, and I see this Calder, and I go like, really? Okay, that's a nice sculpture, and it's a beautiful piece of property. What are the two doing together? It's like really strange. But then I see this. So this is by a Spanish architectural firm named Ensemble. And they applied to, as architects, to design the music studio. And they did not get the commission. Somebody else got the commission. But the owners of Tippett Rise liked their work so much. They said, would you propose sculptures for us? So they made 3 sculptures. I'm only showing you one. You can go online, Tippett, T-I-P-P-E-T, Tippett Rise, like something rising up. And you should go online and look at this. And then you should bloody well go there because this place is incredible. And they've done such a good job of managing the land. They made this by scooping out earth. Then they put plastic in the scoop. So it's like Munich Depression. They make a Munich Depression. They put plastic in the bottom. They put in rebar and concrete. And they let it set. And then they get the biggest crane in Montana to lift up these 2 pieces and join them together. It's called Portal. It has a mate. So this one has the smooth sides on the inside and the rough on the outside. Its mate is just the opposite. Look at that. I mean, that's the best Neolithic, Paleolithic, modern mashup I know of. It's incredible. It's really good. So I just wanted to show this image because I like it so much. It's going to be in my book. It's talking about Michael Heiser and the provocation of double negative and what people do when they go there. What people do is Chris Taylor takes classes of students there once a year, and sometimes he drags along people who make interventions, right? So this is a laser scan of double negative done at night. I think it's one of the most exquisite things that's ever been done with another art object. The legal problem is, am I picturing double negative, which Michael Heiser will not give me permission to reproduce in a photograph and book? Or am I reproducing the laser scan of double negative? I'm hoping it's the latter, but I've had the publisher take out insurance for a loss to cover a lawsuit if Michael Heiser decides to sue us, right? So, or his gallery, double negative. So that this live. You're not involved. Actually, so you claim credit for the image because you commissioned the technician to do this, right? So you could be named in the lawsuit. Awesome. I'll share that. Cool. So this relationship between these things, yeah, and this and us, right, is a very interesting relationship. So thank you very much.